Hello, so this is our two-part mold demo. I'm going to be casting a cactus paddle with this clay body. It's going to be same deal as our first mold. You want to get it to fit in properly into the square rectangular that you're going to be building on. You want nice straight edges for the caudal boards to go on. And you want to leave yourself some space on the edges to put keys. So every mold you make is going to need a sprue and keys. And a sprue is something that it's kind of like a funnel for the slip that you pour into. And so since we already have like a natural shape right here with the cactus paddle, we're going to make the sprue be here. And you just attach a little piece of clay and form it around where you want the clay to travel into. And then once you have that attached on there, you're going to want to push the edges, like I'm going to push the edges of this cactus paddle into the clay at the bottom, just to get it to stick on there and no plaster goes in, causing it to flip all inside. And then we have this extra space that I'm going to fill in with some clay, a little coil of clay, to give us a good edge that the plaster won't go into. So this coil prevents there being undercuts of the object that we're casting. The plaster is going to fill all the space around it, and this clay prevents it from being filled. If the plaster were to get in there, it would harden, and then when you go to take your object off, it would break off, and you want to avoid that situation. And since I'm casting a cactus paddle, I'll have to be very careful not to get stuck with the spikes. And the other end also has an undercut that I need to fill. You're fine. Alright. So now we got rid of our undercuts, and we are ready to put keys on to our mold. You can do keys two ways. You build up like a little sphere cut that in half, and then you form the sphere with your fingers, or the half sphere with your fingers. And you just attach them to the ends, and these, when you go to cast it, the reverse will have these filled in, and that way your mold fits together and it's just not two flat edges stuck together side by side. These will keep the mold in uniform when you go to pour in the slip. So that we have our keys and our sprue, we're ready to build the cotter boards around the object. So now that the cotter boards are all around the mold, we're going to want to line the edges of them with the clay body, just to prevent any spilling from the seams of the cotter boards on the board, like we did for our first mold. But unlike the first mold, we're not going to do it on the inside, because there's already clay in there. want to make sure that you get those seams plugged up. That way, no plaster makes its way out of the form. So this first side of this cactus powder mold is going to be 4 pounds. So I measured 1.5 quarts of water for 4 pounds of plaster. And remember that you want to add the plaster to the water, not the water to the plaster. And since it's waxy, the Nopali cactus paddle is a little bit waxy, it will need to be using Mercazole soap. So I'm just gonna go right for it. And then you gotta shake the mold or cart to get the bubbles to pop, go right to the top. Or use your hands to do so too. And now we wait. Alright, so now our mold is dried for about half an hour, 30 minutes, and so we can demold it. So I'm going to clean the excess clay off of the copper boards, because we're going to use them in a second. So we have our keys, and since I didn't attach them too well, they got pulled off. You get pulled off by the plaster, and you can resolve that by just cleaning them off with your finger. I like to push the edge inward, and then it's an easier way to get the ball of clay out instead of sitting there and scraping it off. Alright. And now I'm going to pull off the excess clay that I used to build up around the thing, around the object. And our sprue is nice and clean. Sometimes the clay does come over, so you just really got to just take your finger and wipe it all off. Right, so this next part is super important. You want to coat every single part of this plaster mold with the Murphy's oil soap. Otherwise, the plaster is just going to stick to itself and you're never going to be able to get this mold out in one piece. Usually ends up breaking. So we're just going to just lather it up with the Murphy's oil soap or the Dawn dish soap. That works too. And you really want to get into the keyholes so that they don't stick in there. And then just get in every single part that is going to have plaster attached to it. You want to be generous, just covering everything with the Murphy's oil soap. Because you want this to get demolded without any major issues. If you want to keep a clean mold, I recommend you get the outside of the mold covered in Murphy's oil soap, just so that the plaster doesn't seep and stick onto itself on the outside. Could give you sharp edges and parts that could just flake off when you're transporting the mold back and forth from your slip casting area to where you store it. After that's all said and done, you also want to beef up your sprue a little bit. I removed the sprue just to get Murphy's oil soap in there. You want this to also protrude out enough so that the other part of the mold has a sprue hole, making the I guess the hole wider for the slip to go into. So now you want to rebuild the caudal boards around your object, your mold. Be ready to go. Right, and then it's going to be the same deal. You're going to want to build up a good barrier of clay around the caudal board so that the plaster doesn't leak out. And this is usually when the plaster leaks out. Because it's hard to get a good, or at least with this one, it was hard to get a good edge contact to seal it. So I'm gonna try my best to get it to not leak everywhere. Because there's some significant spaces between the plaster mold and the caudal board. So now that our caudal boards are built around our mold, I weighed 5 pounds of plaster, which will require 2 quarts of water, and I'm mixing it together. The mold's covered in Murphy's oil soap, as is the cactus paddle. Our sprues out, our edges are all filled. We're ready to pour the plaster in and get our first 2-part mold out of the way. So I used more plaster this time around because my seams weren't, between the mold and the caudal boards weren't really sealed, and there's some space there, and I might have had some loss. Like I have some loss leaking out of this side as well as this side. So I just need to plug that up real quick to avoid a catastrophe. Plaster all over the place, and then my mold will no longer function. So now we're just going to let this sit for about half an hour and we'll be ready to demold. Alright, so now that our mold, our second half of our mold has had time to dry, we're going to take off the caudal boards. What we got. Right. And that is how we make plaster molds. So we had the keyholes that we did with the clay, and they came off when we poured the plaster in. And you can continue to cast, say if you want to do multiples, you can keep using the same paddle, like I would use the same paddle here, until that's gotten completely moldy and deteriorated. Or if you just want to have one cast of it and you can cast it a bunch of times, I find it easier to make multiple molds of the same object, so that way when you go to slip cast, you can demold it, let it dry, and then let the plaster molds dry. Then once they're dry, within a couple of hours, you can reuse it and continuously produce the same object over and over again. You learn a lot through repetition, and you can do multiple things with the objects that you want to cast. So that is how you make a 2-part plaster mold for slip casting.